They say physics is the one language the universe never lies about. Gravity pulls, heat burns, bodies break, minds fatigue. That's how the world is supposed to work. But every few decades, someone steps forward and does something that shouldn't be possible. A monk in the Himalayas who rose from the floor without touching a single breath of wind. A man who didn't sleep for decades and whose brain scans showed no damage. Children who bent metal with nothing but concentration, while government observers watched in silence, and a teenager who may have lit a fusion reaction in a garage built of scrap aluminum. Doctors called them anomalies. Scientists called them frauds. Governments called them confidential. But the footage, the lab notes, and the people who were there all tell a different story. Tonight, we open 10 files where human beings did something our equations say they're not allowed to do. Welcome to Archive 9. The story begins in the winter of 1938, high in the wind-carved cliffs of Tibet, where thin air makes even the strongest men tremble. A German expedition, officially an anthropological survey, climbed toward a remote monastery known only through a handful of trade routes and whispered traveler accounts. The monks there were said to practice an extreme form of meditation, days in silence, weeks without sleep, bodies conditioned to survive cold that could shatter bone. But what the expedition recorded in their journals didn't sound like discipline. It sounded like violation of the very laws keeping us pinned to the earth. They described an elderly monk, barely over 5 feet tall, wrapped in faded saffron cloth. His body was thin, the kind of thin that comes not from starvation, but from decades of subtracting everything unnecessary. His heartbeat, one doctor noted, was astonishingly slow, as if conserving every drop of life. For 3 days, the team observed his rituals, rhythmic breathing, chants that seemed more like controlled frequency pulses, and a low humming that resonated in their chests. The monk's feet never left the ground. Nothing unusual happened until the 4th day. According to the German notes, which were sealed for decades and resurfaced only after the war, the monk stepped onto a circular mat woven with strange geometric patterns. He exhaled once, placed his hands together, and the humming grew so deep it felt like the stones themselves were vibrating. Then, without warning, the air around him seemed to bend. One observer wrote, "It was not lifting. It was a gentle refusal to fall." Another insisted they saw a faint distortion around the monk's robe, like heat rising off asphalt, except the chamber was freezing. Slowly, impossibly, his body rose. 5 centimeters, then 10, then nearly a foot off the floor. The team was terrified. One scientist reportedly fled the room and refused to return. Another dropped his notebook and whispered to the head monk, asking how this was possible. The monk simply replied, "The body is heavy, the mind is not." When the expedition returned to Europe, a split formed immediately. Half the team swore the event happened exactly as described. The other half dismissed it as suggestion, a collective hallucination triggered by altitude and exhaustion. However, a problem emerged. The barometric instruments in the room had recorded a sudden, anomalous pressure drop during the levitation window, something neither hallucination nor chanting could explain. Decades later, modern physicists attempted to reconstruct the phenomenon. They pointed out that acoustic levitation is real. We can suspend tiny particles using tuned frequencies. But a human body? The energy required would be catastrophic. Bones would shatter, organs collapse. Sound waves powerful enough to lift a 60-kilogram body would kill the monk instantly. Yet the monk remained calm, breathing steadily, eyes closed, no tension in the muscles. Not even the dust beneath him stirred. The monastery elders refused interviews. The mat with geometric patterns vanished, and the original journals containing sketches of the ritual were quietly acquired by a private collector, who, according to auction records, paid an unusually large sum and has not allowed public access since. If the event was a trick, it was one no stage illusionist has ever been able to replicate under scientific monitoring. If it was fraud, why did every compass and pressure meter in that room react as though gravity itself shifted for a moment? And if it was real, then someone, centuries before quantum physics, discovered a way to negotiate with the one force we thought was non-negotiable. Do you want to continue with Case 2, the firewalk experiment? In 1976, deep inside a controlled testing facility in Northern California, a small group of physicists, psychologists, and military observers gathered around a long trench filled with burning embers. Temperatures averaged 100 degrees Fahrenheit, easily hot enough to sear flesh on contact. Firewalking demonstrations had existed for centuries, but this wasn't a cultural ritual, a festival, or a spiritual ceremony. This was an experiment designed to break the rule that heat burns human skin every time, without exception. The participants were not monks, performers, or seasoned shamans. They were everyday volunteers, a math teacher, a postal worker, a college student, and a quiet middle-aged woman who insisted she was nobody special. Each had sensors attached to their legs, heart rate monitors strapped to their chests, and electrodes measuring microreactions in the skin. The protocol was strict: no running, no hopping, no tricks. They had to walk at a normal pace over a 12-foot bed of embers, radiating enough heat to melt aluminum. The scientists expected burns. They expected panic. They expected proof that firewalking was nothing more than careful timing and a thin cushion of ash. What they got did not match the textbooks. The first volunteer stepped onto the glowing coals, and nothing happened. No blistering, no recoil. Her skin temperature, recorded by infrared scanners, spiked dangerously high, yet when she reached the other side, her feet were completely unharmed. The next volunteer did the same, and then the next. At first, the researchers reassured each other. The ash layer must be thicker than we predicted. But the reading said otherwise. Several sections of the trench were scraped clean down to the embers, with temperatures consistent from end to end. On the eighth run, the anomaly deepened. The middle-aged woman, the one who claimed no experience of any kind, paused halfway through the walk. She stood directly on the hottest recorded spot for nearly 3 seconds. 3 seconds on a surface hot enough to carbonize bone. The sensors on her feet roared into the red zone. Every physicist in the room braced for catastrophic injury. She kept walking, and when she stepped off, her feet were pink, but unburned. That moment broke the experiment open. The data didn't fit. The thermal exposure was far too high. The duration on the hottest section far too long. A physicist reviewing the footage later wrote in his report, "Even if the ash protected the skin for a fraction of a second, the dwell time eliminates all known mechanisms of safe passage." A psychologist on the team suggested the explanation was mental. That focused attention altered perception of pain, allowing the participants to endure injury without reacting. But injury requires tissue damage. Pain tolerance can't change cellular destruction, and yet tissue destruction simply didn't occur. So the team ran a second test. This time they increased the heat, not by accident, deliberately. Industrial blowers force oxygen into the embers, raising the temperature by nearly 300 degrees. The light turned white hot. No ash layer remained, no safe pockets, just raw, lethal heat. Only one volunteer agreed to attempt it, the same woman from before. She stepped forward, whispered something no microphone caught, and placed her bare foot onto the light-blinding coals. The sensors spiked again. The infrared camera picked up a skin temperature that, by all accounts, should have destroyed the tissue instantly. And still, she walked the entire length, emerging without a single blister. Not even redness this time, as if the heat simply didn't behave the way heat was supposed to around her. Afterward, the project lead suggested an extraordinary possibility. Some participants exhibited unusual thermal conduction, a momentary protective layer formed by moisture or rapid reflex lifting. But when they reviewed the high-speed footage, her foot was planted squarely on the coals. Full weight, full contact. No lift. No retreat, no tricks. Nothing that could be dismissed as sleight of foot. The report was quietly filed, then restricted. Funding was pulled. The lead researcher resigned within the year. Several members of the team later described the incident not as an experiment, but as an event, an encounter with something human biology wasn't prepared to explain. Was it a rare physiological adaptation? A state of consciousness so heightened it altered how heat transferred into the skin? Or was it something older, a dormant ability humans once possessed, buried beneath centuries of forgetting? Because if one person can walk calmly across a surface hot enough to liquefy metal, then maybe the laws of physics don't break. Maybe they simply bend for those who know where to push. The first documented mention appeared in a medical logbook from 1964, a thin beige folder tucked between reports of sleep disorders and neurological trauma. The entry was brief. Subject claims he has not slept in 10 years. No signs of psychosis. No measurable cognitive decline. Most physicians would have dismissed it as delusion. Human beings simply cannot survive without sleep. After 3 days, the mind begins to fracture. After a week, organs falter. After 10 days, hallucinations bloom like fever. Yet the man in the logbook, known publicly only by his initials DH, seemed exempt from every known rule. He was a machinist from Montana, an ordinary life built around steel, noise, and repetition. According to his family, his insomnia began after a minor workplace accident. A steel beam slipped, grazed his shoulder, and knocked him unconscious for several seconds. He walked away seemingly unharmed, except for one detail. That night he didn't sleep, nor the night after, nor the one after that. Weeks passed, then months. His wife grew concerned, then frightened. He was awake at dawn, awake at midnight, awake when the world slept, and awake when the world rose again. But he wasn't irritable, wasn't dazed, wasn't exhausted. He simply carried on, alert, calm, even strangely energized. Eventually, he was admitted to a sleep research center in Washington state. What they found there made no sense. Over a continuous 11-day observation, his brain never entered stage 1 sleep. No slow-wave activity appeared. No REM cycles, no microsleeps, no involuntary lapses. His circadian rhythms remained stable. Blood pressure normal. Reaction time sharp as a pilot's. Every medical metric insisted he should be collapsing. Instead, he played chess with the researchers, memorized entire pages of text, and held conversations through the night without the slightest decrease in clarity. One neurologist described it as a brain operating outside the biological contract. Another privately wondered if the accident had triggered a dormant mechanism, something the human system possessed but never used. Yet every theory failed when confronted with the scans. EEG readings showed a pattern nobody recognized. It resembled wakefulness, but not exactly. The waves were unusually coherent, synchronized across brain regions that rarely fire in unison. It was as if his mind had slipped into a new gear, not sleep, not wakefulness, but a hybrid state that sustained itself without rest. Some speculated he had trained himself subconsciously into perpetual meditation. Others suggested microdoses of dreaming occurring simultaneously with consciousness, a kind of built-in repair mode. But these were guesses, not explanations. No known process could maintain tissue repair, memory consolidation, and emotional regulation while awake indefinitely. And then came the moment that unsettled even the skeptics. On the 12th night of observation, a technician reviewing infrared footage noticed something strange. DH's body temperature dipped a full degree for 14 minutes, then rose again. A temperature shift pattern identical to deep sleep phases, except he was not asleep. He was sitting upright, fully conscious, reading a magazine. The team repeated the experiment. Same result. A controlled drop in core temperature, pupil dilation slowing, heart rate drifting into a rhythm associated with regenerative sleep. Yet he remained awake, eyes open, speaking clearly. 2 years later, the research center lost funding. The lead neurologist was reassigned. The remaining data was boxed, archived, and never referenced again. Reports mentioned the man returned home and continued his life quietly, still claiming he had not slept in over a decade. His final interview, recorded on an old cassette, contains a line researchers couldn't explain. Most people dream with their eyes closed. I just learned to dream with mine open. If his mind truly found a way to bypass sleep, to repair itself while remaining conscious, then he wasn't defying biology. He was revealing one of its deepest secrets. And if one human can rewrite the need for sleep, how many other boundaries of the human body are only rules because no one has ever broken them? The files refer to them simply as T1 VA T2, no last names, no birthplace, no photographs released to the public. What we know comes from a set of declassified notes from a short-lived parapsychology program in the late 1980s, a program so secretive that even its funding trail ends abruptly, as if someone intentionally erased every financial footprint. The twins were 9 years old when they were brought to the study, identical in every biological sense. Same height, same weight, same facial symmetry. But what caught the researchers' attention wasn't their appearance, it was their behavior. They seemed to operate as one mind split into two bodies. During their initial assessment, one twin would draw a random geometric shape on a piece of paper, alone in a sealed room, while the other, in a completely separate building, would draw the same shape in real time with uncanny accuracy. Not just circles or triangles, complex shapes, broken lines, asymmetric spirals, even distortions introduced halfway through the drawing. At first, the researchers suspected covert signaling, so they tightened protocols. The children were placed in soundproof chambers. No cameras, no speakers, no reflective surfaces. Heart rate monitors and EEG caps were applied to detect any kind of pattern tapping or rhythm-based communication. The results only became stranger. When Twin 1 concentrated, Twin 2's occipital lobe, the visual center, lit up even though Twin 2 wasn't looking at anything. When Twin 2 clenched her fists, Twin 1's motor cortex activated milliseconds later. Their signals weren't mirrored. They were synchronized, rising and falling like a single waveform. One researcher described it as a neurological duet performed by two instruments sharing the same composer. Then came the object movement trials, the experiments that cemented the legend. The twins were placed in two separate rooms, each with a small metal sphere resting on a glass table. Their task was simple: try to move the sphere using only focus. For hours, nothing happened. The experimental director, frustrated, suggested ending the session early. That's when Twin 1 began to cry, quietly, without warning. No one understood why, until the observer in the second room radioed in, voice trembling. The sphere in front of Twin 2 had rolled 3 centimeters to the left. The timing matched perfectly. Twin 1's emotional spike and Twin 2's sphere movement occurred within the same second. The researchers repeated the trial, this time switching the spheres, swapping rooms, altering temperature, changing lighting, any variable they could think of. Every time one twin's emotional state shifted sharply, fear, joy, or sudden concentration, the sphere in the other room responded. Never far, always subtle, but undeniably real. The glass tables, designed to eliminate vibration, showed no tremors. The floors were stabilized, airflow controlled, electrostatic charge tested and neutralized. Still, the spheres moved. Days later, the program escalated. Electroencephalogram overlays revealed a pattern no one had seen before. A neural link that did not behave like coincidence, communication, or mimicry. When one twin focused intensely, the other's frontal lobe entered a trance-like state, as if receiving a silent command. This led to the final and most controversial experiment. Twin 2 was instructed to maintain a calm, blank state. Twin 1 was led into a separate chamber with a new object, a thin aluminum rod suspended by wire. The goal was not movement, but influence. Could one child's intention affect the other's ability, even without her trying? What happened next caused the project's termination. As Twin 1 lowered her breathing and stared at the rod, Twin 2 fell into a sudden trance. Eyes unfocused, body rigid. Her EEG spiked violently, not in distress but in intensity. The aluminum rod began to sway, then twist, slowly, deliberately, against all airflow measurements. The director panicked and ordered an immediate stop. Both children collapsed moments later, unharmed but deeply disoriented. The program was shut down within the week. The rods, spheres, and experimental logs were boxed and removed by a military courier team the following morning. None of those materials have resurfaced. Skeptics later argued the twins were reacting to subtle cues, breathing patterns, floor vibrations, microshifts, but the synchronized EEG waves, the sealed chambers, the metal sphere that rolled the moment the other twin cried, none of that fits neatly into illusion or chance. If telekinesis itself remains unproven, the twins demonstrated something equally troubling, a form of entanglement between human minds that mimics quantum behavior. Two individuals acting as one system, two brains sharing one intention, Two children bending matter through a connection we cannot measure and cannot explain. The first verified record of him surfaced in a rural clinic in southern Brazil in 1991. A farmer had come in with a machete injury, a deep gash across his forearm, the kind that normally requires stitches, antibiotics, and weeks of recovery. Yet when the attending nurse peeled back the bandage 2 days later, she froze. The tissue wasn't just healing quickly, it was regenerating, knitting together in a way no adult human tissue should. When questioned, the farmer mentioned a man from his village, a quiet, soft-spoken figure who visited homes at dusk. He carried no medical tools, no herbs, no ointments, just his hands which he placed lightly over wounds while murmuring in a language nobody recognized. The villagers called him O Restorador, the restorer. Word spread. Within months, a team of medical volunteers traveled to the region to observe him. They expected a charismatic fraud, or at best, a placebo effect embellished by rumor. Instead, they found a man who avoided eye contact, refused payment, and seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. His name was Amaro. The researchers conducted the first controlled test using a volunteer with a chronic, non-healing ulcer, a condition notorious for resisting treatment. They documented the wound thoroughly: size, depth, tissue degradation. Infrared imaging confirmed poor circulation. Amaro was invited into the clinic and asked to perform whatever technique he normally used. He placed his hands less than an inch above the wound. No touching, no heat, no electrical charge, just a steady, silent presence. For exactly 7 minutes, nothing appeared to happen. But afterward, the imaging equipment picked up a faint change, an unexpected increase in localized tissue oxygenation. Within 24 hours, the ulcer had shrunk by nearly 20%. Within 72 hours, half of the necrotic tissue had been replaced with fresh, healthy granulation. Within 2 weeks, the wound was gone. The volunteers insisted on a second experiment, this time using a small dermal biopsy, a clinical injury created under sterile conditions. The sample area was photographed, measured, and logged. Amaro repeated the same ritual. The results were more dramatic. Not only did the tissue regenerate at a rate 5 times faster than baseline, but something stranger emerged in the scans. Microstructures resembling embryonic fibroblast clusters, cells that typically appear only during early development. It was as if the skin had been instructed to remember an ability it had forgotten decades ago. The scientists presented the data to a university lab in Rio de Janeiro. The lab dismissed it as impossible. Adult tissue cannot revert to regenerative states without genetic damage or cancerous mutation. But when they reviewed the biopsy slides, they were forced to admit the tissue was healthy. No abnormalities, no unchecked growth, just repair at a speed that should not exist. So they brought Amaro in for more tests. That's when he refused, not angrily, not defensively. He simply said he didn't want to be studied. When asked why, he replied with a single sentence that left the room silent. If you measure a gift too closely, it leaves you. He returned to his village. Weeks later, he vanished. No forwarding address, no records, no sightings. When investigators arrived, the villagers spoke gently about him, but offered no leads. Some said he'd traveled to the north. Others said he'd gone into the forest alone. One elderly woman said she saw him the night before he left. According to her, his hands glowed faintly. Experts scoffed at the claim, pointing to after images, lantern reflections, or simple exaggeration. But the infrared footage from his first clinic visit, footage forgotten until the early 2000s, revealed something unsettling. When Amaro placed his hands above the ulcer, the camera picked up a localized thermal anomaly, a ring of heat around his palms, but a zone of cold directly beneath, a pattern contrary to basic thermodynamics. Heat surrounds, cold focuses, as if something was pulling energy inward, reorganizing tissue at the cellular level. If the healer was performing fraud, he did so under clinical scrutiny with biopsies, imaging, and medical logs. If he exploited placebo, he did so on wounds that physiologically cannot respond to belief alone. And if he truly triggered regenerative pathways, then somewhere in the world walked a man who awakened a biological switch we once had, long before evolution decided we no longer needed it. A man who could command the body to rebuild itself. But the question the files never answer is simple. Was he unique, or was he simply the first one we noticed? The story begins not in a laboratory, but on a military airfield tucked behind a restricted canyon in Nevada. According to the documents, the program was disguised as a routine neural interface study, standard research into controlling robotic limbs through electrical brain signals. Nothing unusual, nothing classified, but the first anomaly appeared on day 12 of testing when a civilian engineer noticed something impossible. One of the drones turned mid-flight before receiving any command. The official notes describe the volunteers as non-specialists, a truck mechanic, a college dropout, a retired school teacher, and a young man named Elias Hart, the least educated of the group, but also the one whose data would break open the project. They were fitted with EEG caps, seated in isolated rooms, and told to focus on simple tasks, blinking lights, moving cursors, imagining the sensation of lifting their arms. Basic neural interface calibration. The drones outside were meant to respond only to deliberate, conscious signals. On day 19, the project lead asked each volunteer to perform a directed intention test, imagining a drone rising vertically. The mechanic managed a slight lift. The school teacher produced jittery side motions. The dropout failed completely, but when Elias concentrated, the drone shot upward with force strong enough to trip the automated safety cut. At first, the team assumed equipment failure, but the playback logs showed no command was sent, no signal packet, no EM spike. The drone moved before the system could translate his intention, as if it reacted not to a neural signal, but to something upstream of it. The director ordered deeper analysis. That's when they noticed the second anomaly. Elias's EEG activity didn't behave like any known interface pattern. Typical brain-controlled systems rely on noisy electrical bursts. Elias produced almost none. His readings were clean, eerily clean, as if his thoughts bypassed the neural noise that drowns out most human intention. So the team escalated the test. Two drones were placed on opposite ends of the range. Elias was instructed to guide the left drone in a straight line. He nodded, focused, and both drones moved, simultaneously, perfectly mirrored, even though each drone operated on a separate frequency band. The room fell silent. The engineers recalibrated everything. New frequency, different encryption, randomized command delays, no pattern held. Whenever Elias intended something sharply, accelerate, tilt, climb, both drones responded in unison, not to the signals, but seemingly to the intention itself. This forced the team into an uncomfortable conclusion. The drones were not reading his brain. They were reacting to something ambient he was emitting, a field, a pattern, an unrecognized signal. Something that remained invisible to their instruments but moved metal all the same. Military oversight increased overnight. By the third month, the project shifted from research to assessment. Could this ability be weaponized? One test required Elias to influence a drone he wasn't even connected to. No EEG cap, no sensors, just line of sight through reinforced glass. He stared at the drone, and it rotated a full 90 degrees without any input registered on the control panel. The engineers panicked. The director demanded answers. Elias simply said quietly, "I'm not controlling it. I'm convincing it." When asked what that meant, he struggled to explain. He spoke of a pressure behind his thoughts, a sensation of pushing without muscles. Not telekinesis, nothing so dramatic. More like leaning your mind toward an object and the object leaning back. The final experiment is redacted in nearly every surviving record, but one page remains, a fragment. It describes a blackout. Every drone in the hangar powered off simultaneously, despite being on separate internal grids. Cameras recorded no surge, no EMP, no equipment malfunction. All systems went dead for exactly 7 seconds. When power returned, Elias was unconscious, though unharmed. What triggered the shutdown remains unknown. 2 days later, the program was dismantled without explanation. Elias was escorted off base by 2 officials and driven away in an unmarked vehicle. He never returned to his home. His family received a brief, unsigned letter stating he had entered a long-term research fellowship with no other details. The engineers were reassigned. The drones were removed. The data servers were wiped to military standard. But a single handwritten note survived, found years later in a mislabeled storage box. He did not control machines. They adapted to him. If that's true, if intention itself can influence physical systems, then the boundary between thought and matter may be thinner than we ever imagined. For decades, videos of so-called human magnets circulated on late-night television. Men and women with cookware, coins, even wrenches sticking to their skin. Skeptics dismiss them as party tricks, sweaty skin, slight oil residue, or clever camera angles. Most demonstrations fell apart under scrutiny. But in 2009, one case forced researchers to reconsider. It happened in Belgrade, during a public health exhibition attended by thousands. A man named Milan Vukovic, a factory worker with no known medical anomalies, agreed to undergo open, on-site testing to debunk the claims once and for all. He stood shirtless on a stage, body wiped down with alcohol by medical staff and dried with sterilized cloth. Temperature controlled. Powder applied to eliminate moisture. Every textbook explanation for sticky skin neutralized. Then he lifted a 20-pound steel plate and placed it against his chest. It stayed, not for a moment, not for a trick, for nearly a full minute. The plate didn't slide, didn't wobble, didn't behave like an object resting on a horizontal shelf of skin. It clung as if held by a force with direction, an invisible pull toward his body. The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. But the scientific observers remained frozen, staring at their instruments, which were showing something unprecedented, a faint but measurable magnetic field emanating from Milan's torso. Not strong, nothing close to a rare Earth magnet, but real, detectable, and fluctuating. Over the next hours, Milan was subjected to every test the team could improvise. Glass objects did not stick. Plastics fell instantly. Wood slid off without hesitation. But metals, even smooth, polished steel with no friction edges, adhered in specific regions of his chest and back, as if his body had localized magnetic zones. When the researchers mapped these areas, the pattern resembled something odd, a loose alignment with nerve clusters rather than muscle structure. Then came the second anomaly. During a controlled test with calibrated metal cylinders, Milan pressed a light aluminum rod to his sternum. Aluminum is non-magnetic. It should have fallen immediately, but for 9 long seconds it stayed suspended, not as strongly as steel, but clearly resisting gravity. The lead scientist, a physicist specializing in electromagnetic materials, was visibly shaken. Aluminum has no response to magnetism under normal conditions. Something else had to be at work. They recorded Milan's body temperature, elevated slightly. His heart rate, normal, but his skin conductivity surged before each successful adhesion, then dropped immediately after. It looked like his nervous system was firing in coordinated bursts, generating something that acted like magnetism, but didn't behave like any known magnetic field. That was when the neurologists stepped in. EEG tests revealed a pattern they couldn't categorize. Not stress, not excitement, not relaxation. Instead, Milan produced short bursts of synchronized neural firing that resembled what's observed in deep meditative states, except his happened instantly, on command, with no training. The researchers began to suspect that the phenomenon wasn't magnetic at all. They proposed alternatives: electroadhesion, known in robotics; localized pressure microchanges, unproven in humans; bioelectric field coupling, theoretical at best. But none of these explanations accounted for the aluminum. The breakthrough came accidentally. When Milan grew tired and sat down, the steel plate the team had been using refused to stick anymore. No matter how many times he tried, the adhesion effect weakened. Instruments showed his bioelectric output dropping, but his magnetic field, the weak, inexplicable one, remained stable. That's when the researchers realized something unsettling. The effect wasn't tied to magnetism or chemical residue. It was tied to intention. Whenever Milan focused, the phenomenon strengthened. Whenever he relaxed, it faded. The more he tried, the more metal clung to him. The moment he became self-conscious, everything collapsed. On day 3 of testing, they attempted a final experiment. Milan stood on a pressure-calibrated platform. He was instructed to hold a metal object at chest level without touching it, using only the same internal focus he used during adhesion. The object did not rise, no levitation, no cinematic miracle. But something else happened. The object tilted, just slightly, toward him. 3 degrees, then 5, then stopped. Every reading in the room confirmed no airflow, no vibration, no hidden wires. A tilt meant one thing: a force acted upon the object in a directional manner. Was it weak? Yes. Was it subtle? Absolutely. Was it impossible? According to physics, completely. Before more experiments could continue, the funding for the study vanished without explanation. Milan returned home, refusing interviews. He lived quietly until his death in 2017. His autopsy revealed nothing abnormal. No unusual organ structures, no implants, no conditions that might explain the phenomenon. But his medical records list a final note left by the last physician who examined him. A note written in the margin, not meant for public reading. He said it felt like pulling a thread in his chest, a thread the world couldn't see but the metal could. If human intention can distort physical forces, even by a fraction, then the line between biology and physics is far blurrier than our textbooks admit. The file begins with a washed-out newspaper clipping from 1998. A boy no older than 16, standing beside a cluttered garage filled with wires, beakers, and scrap metal scavenged from junkyards. His name was Jason Reed, a quiet high school sophomore from rural Oregon, known mostly for skipping football practice to take apart broken appliances behind his house. But the article wasn't about a science fair project. It was about something he built in that garage, a machine he claimed could trigger a cold fusion reaction using no more power than a household outlet. The reporter who wrote the story called it youthful imagination. Another paper dismissed it as garage pseudoscience. Jason himself barely spoke during interviews, but his physics teacher, who had seen the machine operate, insisted something extraordinary was happening. The design was primitive: a stainless steel cylinder, water electrolysis chamber, improvised vacuum pump, and an arrangement of electrodes that shouldn't have produced anything interesting. But when Jason activated the device, sensors in the classroom recorded a sudden temperature spike without any measurable external heat source. Temperature up. Energy output higher than energy input, a violation of the known laws of thermodynamics. The school dismissed the readings as faulty equipment, so Jason rebuilt the setup in his garage, adding new instruments borrowed from the chemistry lab. When he tested it again, the results were even more unsettling. A burst of heat accompanied by a faint blue-white flash, followed by a metallic crackling sound. The teacher, shaken, quietly called a professor at a local university. 2 days later, a team of 3 scientists visited Jason's home. They asked him to run the machine. He hesitated, then agreed. The experiment lasted 37 seconds. In that time, every one of their instruments detected a sudden thermal pulse, a localized drop in radiation consistent with neutron absorption, and a microsecond-level spike in unexplained energy release. When the scientists confronted Jason afterward, he simply shrugged and said, "I just copied patterns." Patterns? He explained that he'd been studying old patents, obscure diagrams from the 1950s, scribbled notes from fringe inventors, marginalia in long-forgotten science books. He said they felt right, even when the math didn't make sense. The university attempted to replicate the reaction in their controlled lab. They failed, repeatedly. No flash, no heat burst, no anomaly. But when they invited Jason in to assemble the components himself, the reaction happened again, weaker but still clearly beyond chemical explanation. The dean recommended a full research grant. That same week, everything changed. 2 unmarked black sedans arrived at Jason's school. Men in suits interviewed the principal, seized the machine from his garage, and confiscated all notes, sketches, and equipment. Jason's parents were told the materials posed a safety hazard. The scientists who witnessed the anomaly received letters instructing them to cease all communication about the project. Within a month, Jason was gone. His parents claimed he had been accepted into a special program on the East Coast. He did not return phone calls. Friends never heard from him again. The teachers who spoke to him last recalled a strange calmness, as though he understood something they didn't. Years later, one of the scientists broke silence. In a private email never meant to be published, he wrote, "The reaction was not classical fusion. It was something else, something catalytic. The boy wasn't generating energy. He was opening a door to it." Another scientist anonymously provided a final detail. The machine emitted a frequency during its activation, a low pulsing hum that did not match any electrical signature they knew. When analyzed, the waveform resembled patterns found in certain quantum resonance models, models not widely discussed until decades later. If Jason's device truly tapped into a new energy pathway, then it's no surprise the machine vanished. Governments bury anything that threatens entire industries, but the question remains, did a 16-year-old kid stumble onto cold fusion, or did he rediscover something the world once knew and forgot? The research began with a simple question: why do human beings emit light? Most people don't know this, but every person on Earth glows, faintly, invisibly, releasing photons as a byproduct of cellular metabolism. Normally, this biophoton emission is so weak that only specialized equipment can detect it. In 2011, a small group of biomedical physicists in Kyoto set out to measure how meditation and emotional states influence this natural glow. Their goal was modest: map fluctuations, identify stress signatures, maybe explore new methods for diagnosing fatigue. What they found went far beyond metabolism. The early tests were predictable. Subjects emitted more light when stressed, less when calm, a stable pattern. But then a volunteer named Haruto, a 42-year-old salaryman with no spiritual background, produced an anomaly. During a guided breathing session, his biophoton emissions didn't decrease as expected. They increased, slightly at first, then dramatically. Within 8 minutes, his light output surged to 20 times the normal human baseline. The machines misread it as sensor overload. The room dimmed. Technicians reset everything. But when the detectors recalibrated, they recorded the same impossible spike: a human body emitting enough light to be faintly visible on long exposure cameras. No one spoke for several seconds. Haruto didn't notice anything unusual. He simply said he felt weightless, as if something inside him had become unstuck. The team launched a larger study, anonymous, closed, undisclosed to the university's ethics board. They recruited people with meditation experience, trauma survivors, choir singers, marathon runners, and one man who had recently emerged from a month-long silent retreat. The results were inconsistent at first, then a pattern emerged. The human body emitted significantly more light when breath slowed to below 6 per minute, heart rate variability increased, and the subject entered what EEGs labeled a coherent consciousness state. But the most startling discovery came in the 4th month. A long exposure camera captured a faint outline, a halo-like field around a participant's body. It wasn't a photographic artifact. The detectors picked it up too, a soft, structured glow extending 3 inches beyond the skin. Not random scatter, not reflection, a field. When the team enhanced the footage, the glow appeared to pulse in tandem with the participants' breathing, contracting, expanding, responding as if it had form or attention. That's when they called in Dr. Saito, a physicist known for his controversial work on ultra-weak photon emissions. He proposed a theory that unsettled everyone in the room. If human consciousness can synchronize cellular activity, it may create a temporary light structure, a light body, an organized field rather than random emission. The experiments intensified. They placed participants inside a dark chamber lined with superconductive detectors. The instructions: relax, breathe slowly, and focus on a single emotional memory. One volunteer, a young woman recalling a childhood moment with her mother, produced a pattern so complex it resembled a fractal, a geometric light signature stable for nearly 12 seconds. Its symmetry was mathematically precise, too precise for biology, too structured for noise. Another participant, a retired architect, generated a light burst that triggered a measurable temperature drop in the room. A third produced a flickering wave around his spine that traveled upward before dissipating like mist. The most dramatic case happened on a rainy night in October. A participant named Raina entered the chamber. She was quiet, with a history of severe anxiety. The team expected minimal results. Instead, the detectors registered a sudden surge the moment she closed her eyes. A spike so intense that two machines simultaneously shut down. When they reviewed the footage, they saw something impossible. Her body had become partially luminous, not glowing like a lamp, not radiant like fire, but outlined, traced by thin threads of light following her silhouette, drifting like soft trails of smoke. When she exhaled, the glow brightened. When she inhaled, it dimmed. She later described the sensation, like my body was both here and not here. The team attempted to replicate the event. They couldn't. They tried meditation experts, monks, athletes, even a neuroscientist who had practiced altered state breathing for 30 years. Some produced faint outlines, small glimmers, soft pulses, but nothing reached Raina's level. Then one night, she confessed something. It wasn't meditation. It was the moment I stopped trying to be in my body. Shortly after, the university received an order suspending the research indefinitely. Equipment was confiscated, hard drives taken, funding revoked without explanation. Only a handful of printouts survived, stored quietly at a private collection. When one document contains a final hypothesis from Dr. Saidu, consciousness may not be a product of the body. It may be an organizing field, temporarily inhabiting it. Under certain states, the field reveals itself. If that's true, if the human body can produce a structured light field tied to emotion, intention, or awareness, then the question isn't whether humans glow. It's what that glow is trying to tell us. The final file in this collection doesn't come from a monastery, a battlefield, or a government lab. It comes from a basement. In 1974, a psychology professor at Stanford named Dr. Alden Price began a private, unsanctioned study into group consciousness. His theory, ignored and mocked by colleagues, claimed that human intention wasn't additive, but multiplicative. One mind focusing on an object creates a ripple, but 10 minds focusing together? He believed the effect could become exponential. He never published a paper. He never submitted a proposal. Instead, he invited 9 of his graduate students into a soundproof laboratory beneath the psychology building late at night, under the guise of meditation research. The experiment was simple. 10 participants would sit in a circle around a small wooden platform holding a single object, a polished river stone the size of a fist. The instructions were unusual. They were told not to imagine the stone rising, not to force it, not to try. Instead, Dr. Price asked them to do something counterintuitive. Release your attention until the object becomes meaningless, then allow the idea rising to exist as if it came from the stone itself. The early sessions produced nothing. Hours of silence, fatigue, frustration. Most students assumed Price was conducting a test in obedience or patience. But on the ninth night, subtle irregularities emerged in the recordings. Sensitive microphones captured a faint tremor, not in the table, but in the air around the stone. Electromagnetic sensors displayed tiny fluctuations, oscillating in sync with the group's breathing. Price grew excited. The students grew uneasy. Then the event happened. During a session at 3:14 a.m., the stone shifted, not upward, sideways, rolling 2 inches to the left with no contact, no airflow, no measurable vibration. One student gasped. Another fled the room. The cameras, ancient and grainy, captured the motion clearly. A gentle push from nowhere. Price insisted they continue. Over the next weeks, the phenomenon grew stronger. A slight rotation, a brief hover lasting half a second, then a full lift, a rise so slow and deliberate it defied every explanation they carried into that room. According to the recovered notes, the stone ascended 4.3 centimeters above the platform for a duration of nearly 3 seconds. Not a jump, not a bounce, a suspension. The students were terrified. Price, obsessed. He pushed the group into deeper sessions, sometimes lasting until dawn. He demanded emotional synchronization, asking them to breathe together, think together, and, in his words, merge intention into a single field. Some sessions produced nothing. Others produced measurable anomalies, temperature dips, synchronized heart rate patterns, and once a magnetic shift that caused a compass on the table to spin slowly as if dragged by an unseen current. Then everything unraveled. On the 47th session, the stone didn't rise. Instead, one of the students did. Not entirely, not dramatically, but her body, or part of it, flickered. In the dim light, 3 witnesses swore they saw her outline shimmer, edges blurring as if separating from her physical form by a fraction of an inch. A distortion like heat haze. For less than a second, then normal again. She fainted. Price ordered everyone out. The project ended that night. The university forced him into early retirement. The lab was locked, sealed, and converted into storage. Students were instructed to keep quiet. Most complied, but one, decades later, anonymously released a folder of Price's handwritten notes. Inside was the final entry. Levitation does not require force. Force is the language of matter. Consciousness uses a different grammar. When 10 minds aligned, the stone moved. When one mind surrendered, the body flickered. We did not lift the object. We weakened the world's certainty that it must fall. Skeptics say the students hallucinated, that exhaustion, suggestion, and dim lights created illusions, that the stone movements were subtle vibrations misinterpreted by tired minds. But the audio logs, the synchronized biometric readings, and the strange electromagnetic pulses, none of that fits hallucination. And if even part of Price's theory is true, then levitation isn't the violation of physics we thought it was. It's the violation of a deeper assumption, that reality is fixed, immovable, immune to human intention. But what if reality is only stable because we agree it is? And what happens, truly happens, when enough minds stop agreeing? We've spent the last hour staring at stories that shouldn't exist. Monks who rose from the floor, children who bent metal through shared intention, bodies that healed faster than biology allows, and a teenager who may have triggered a reaction that still terrifies government labs today. Each case breaks something fundamental. Gravity, thermodynamics, neurology, the rules we use to convince ourselves the universe is predictable. But here's the part that lingers. None of these people knew each other. Different continents, different cultures, different decades. Yet every one of them touched the same invisible wall and pushed through it. Maybe we were wrong to call these events supernatural. Maybe they're natural, just rare, glimpses of capacities the rest of us never learned to access. Or maybe they are warning signs, cracks in the physics we treat as unbreakable, reminding us that our understanding of reality is still embarrassingly small. Because if even one of these cases is real, just one, then the question isn't how they did it. The question is, what else can the human body do that we haven't discovered yet, or we're never meant to? Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some files don't close, they wait. Welcome and goodbye from Archive 9.